This year marks the 20th anniversary of the demise of MG Rover, and in those final 5 years of business, their independence regained from BMW, it would be fair to say that the firm was all but dead. After the old Rover group was split 3 ways, the resulting rump lacked the engineering facilities, the financial ability, the sales infrastructure, and the brand image required to survive. Of course, the irregularities that came to light after the fact put a huge caveat on all that, but today on TwinCam, I want to bring us back to the days of the Rover Group as a BMW company, where an ounce of ambition still existed with the launch of the last all-new Rover, a car now finally winning over the sceptical with its refinement and beauty, the Rover 75. A few years ago, my dad had an MG Rover era 75, and though it certainly wasn't without its issues, it was a car you sat and proudly admired, so naturally I had to get myself some literature. And I wound up with this launch brochure from all the way back in 1999, where even after BMW had threatened to close Rover altogether, the 75 acted as their beacon of 2 things. Modernity in the time of cool Britannia, with a distinct and unique image for the first time in years, as well as a beacon of history, where again, for the first time in years, Rover were not afraid of looking to the past, shunning the Austin and British Leyland influence, bypassing it all to see the Longship's glory days of the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And that sense of embracing everything great about Rover, the character within the name, is immediately reflected in both the photography and in the copy. We set out to create a car that would put the joy back into motoring. The only place to start was with a clean sheet of paper. Our motivation comes from the desire to build one of the most comfortable and inspiring cars in the world. Notice how that contrasts somewhat with how Rover marketed themselves in the early 1990s, where performance became an integral part of how they perceived themselves. We had the Metro GTI, the Rover 220 and 420 turbos, the 620 Ti, and of course the big Rover Vitesse. Yet with BMW offering Rover support and taking that side of the market themselves, those working on the 75 could embrace a slower, more relaxed and more comfortable character. That's what we'll see throughout this brochure, and it's what this shot immediately gives us. Compare this tone with that of this brochure for my E46 BMW, and it's all about kind of dynamism, about intent, with bright white and silver tones, all against the earthiness of the Rover 75. So Rover are confident here, not only in their future, but also their positioning. The most advanced technology in the world isn't something you see, it's something you feel. And in the text, the adjectives they choose to use are smoother, more refined, quieter. And this stationary car in shot is relaxed, its image to me embracing refinement above all else. A picture of inspiration, dynamic integrity. The performance is played out beneath the surface. These 3 pages don't just follow down that similar track, but they're so unapologetic about their abandonment of the obsession with stiffness and huge alloy wheels and lap times. The Rover 75 is a car to lollop about the countryside in. With the windows down and sunroof open, your favourite music playing, while you aren't driving for driving's sake, but for being outdoors and in an environment that is so radically different to almost any other car in its class. To those ends, I think it's a gorgeous looking car. For me, the best looking saloon car of the past 50 years. not only winning an award for its beauty from the Italian motoring press, but also having many of its lines emulated decades later by the likes of the Rolls-Royce Ghost, designed by a company that is now, of course, owned by BMW. In beautiful, natural colours like Wedgwood blue and moonstone green, this car is again the antithesis of the growing, aggressive nature of car design. And though it is still somewhat imposing, with hooded headlamps and that beautifully proportioned grille, it's all flowing lines and gentle scalloping. Even the shut lines are elegant. This one behind the headlamps, for example, could easily have been awkward. Usually it would flow into the bottom of the headlamps, but that would ruin the hooded illusion, so the wing tapers to a point, the gap flowing back to its source. On the second of these 3 pages, however, we're introduced to the concept of integrity, something that Rover clearly viewed as a big part of the 75's appeal, described as establishing a new standard of structural integrity for a car of its type. And if we bypass discussion of the suspension for a moment, we see that morph into the establishment of safety in no uncertain terms. Before we make you comfortable, we make you safe. And though there isn't much in here that would surprise us, it's clear that the 75 was bang up to date back in 1999. But I just want to touch again on the image thing. Look at what our model family here are all wearing. Now sure, it's clearly the 90s and no manufacturer would use models wearing rags in their brochures. But I can't help but feel that everyone is dressed very appropriately for the Rover 75. But back to safety, and this strength inherent in the 75's design led to a few myths surrounding its conception. Down the middle of the car there's what would traditionally be a transmission tunnel. But this car is front-wheel drive, and as BMW, in this era at least, always built rear-wheel drive cars, a lot of people state their assumed fact that the 75 was based on the platform of either the E39 5 Series or E46 3 Series. But in truth, it's based on neither of these cars. Sure, Rover had access to and used a lot of BMW systems in the manufacturer of the 75, but in terms of engineering freedom, the Brits could do as they pleased. Indeed, the front end of this car rides on McPherson struts, the same as used by BMW, but also the same as Rover had used in many of their cars since the early 1980s. At the back, however, we have a version of BMW's Z-axle, a very well controlled multi-link system that debuted with the E36 3 Series in 1990. Based on this, I totally understand why it may be perceived that Rover had this dictated to them by the Germans. But again, this was most probably due to Rover's access to BMW rather than BMW's insistence. There was nothing fitted to any existing Rover model that could be modified to suit the 75. The beam axle from the Rover 200, for example, wasn't well controlled enough for an executive saloon, while the double wishbones from Rover's 400, 600 and 800 all had intellectual property belonging to Honda. A car like the Rover 75 required an independent rear suspension that was well controlled, safe, and allowed good suspension travel. It just so happens that during the 75's development, Rover and BMW were also co-developing the R50 Mini, which was dictated by BMW as having a Z-axle rear end, and as it had to be re-engineered for front-wheel drive, Rover knew all there was to know about this system, so employed it again for the 75. It would not have made any sense to do anything other than this, but we have to return to the transmission tunnel. Fast forward 5 years to when Rover decided to build a rear-drive V8 powered 75, and they had to give the car a whole new floor pan with some new interior fittings and a new rear suspension to support the conversion. If this was a simple E39 with different styling and running gear, then they wouldn't have needed to do this. Instead, the tunnel down the centre was all about strength and solidity, leading the 75 to become very nearly the first ever car to be awarded 5 stars by Euro NCAP. This car was objectively safer than any contemporary BMW, but there is potentially another myth to contend with. Now, I don't know whether this is true, but it's reported that BMW forced Rover to de-spec side airbags from base model 75s in order to downgrade the car to only 4 stars. You might question why their parent company would do such a thing, but by the time of this car's launch, BMW were actively threatening Rover and searching swiftly for an exit plan. We're quickly brought back to the ambience, however, and that image I tried to create before of how a 75 driver was supposed to use their car is relayed here. When you want a quiet moment, just take a drive. And what's interesting is how the chrome and the swooshiness of the Rover acts in contrast to many of the saloons around at the same time. Of course, Rover's marketing departments curated these photographs, considering the cars that surround the 75. You aren't going to see a Jaguar S-Type, for example, even if that car is larger and much more expensive than the 75, never mind being really quite ugly. Rover's overwhelming need here is to mark the 75 out as not only being luxurious and expensive feeling, but also unique, offering an experience you're supposed to believe was alien to the average motorist. But this is where I think the 75's styling success lies. Because while the revival of the Mini and the Fiat 500 were great examples of retro design, there are also a few misses. The new Beetle, for example, and most relevant to us, the aforementioned S-Type. Because of the way that cars have changed over the years, I think it's near impossible to create a good-looking tribute to a larger classic car. As I said, the S-Type wound up as a seriously ugly duckling. But while the 75 is undoubtedly retro in a number of areas, it was also totally novel. As its designer, Richard Woolley, made abundantly clear, the Rover 75 was brand new. It's not a tribute to any older Rover, with just bits of the character from cars like the P5 coming in to inform it. This is less what Jaguar were doing, harking back to the good old days, but instead imagining what a Rover would now look like had its bloodline remained intact. And I feel that's a very refreshing way to view the 75. Yet because it was treated like a blank slate, without the trends of the 90s corrupting it, this car is also remarkably timeless. I reckon a company like Jaguar could rebadge this car, launch it today, and people would think it was brilliant. I mentioned earlier how Rolls-Royce have plenty of the 75's visual character in their most recent offerings, and it only reinforces my view from before that the Rover 75 is the best looking saloon car of the past 50 years, and why I would have felt really quite special had I been around to buy one in 1999. There is a bit more of Rover's P5 and P6 inside, however, but unlike almost anything else from the 90s, which looked silly with wood on the dashboard, this car looks awesome, and it's very clear to see why. Instead of designing a plastic fantastic dashboard, then coating it in whatever material they saw fit, Rover took their base materials, wood and leather, then created an interior to suit them. You'll notice if we fold the brochure out here that early 75s were only available with the same walnut trim on the dashboard, because that is both central to Rover's newfound character under BMW and how their designers wanted it to look. It's just a supremely classy place to be, down to the shelf above the glove box and the soft fabric on the doors. The only Downside to the 75's interior is one it takes a bit of time with one to notice. The glove box handle is chromed, reflecting back at the passenger a view of their own crotch. Over the page, it's made very clear how they wanted to integrate the wood, seeing the accessory walnut gear knob and steering wheel. But what we also see from this angle is the integration of those BMW systems I mentioned from earlier. If you're familiar with BMWs from this era, then you'll recognise the fresh air control for the centre vents, the headlamp controls by the door, and of course, the head unit and sat-nav system. This car therefore had probably the most competent entertainment system from any mainstream manufacturer, all thanks to their BMW ownership. But what BMW had less influence over are the engine choices. As ever, the vibe of relaxation and comfort is here in abundance. Rover proud to state that the last thing you'll ever think about is what's under the bonnet. Before we talk about those engines, however, it's interesting to note what's at the bottom of this text here. Because the Rover 75 is all about giving you choice, and you can choose any of the 4 engine options to go with whichever gearbox you prefer. But that's actually an understatement, because if we refer to the trim levels we saw earlier, classic, club and connoisseur, you can mix and match trims with engines in whichever combination you like. That's something unfortunately absent in today's world. First up is Rover's KV6, which sounds incredible and makes very competitive power for its capacity and era, but it's not the best of engines to live with, either from a reliability, servicing or economy perspective. I'm sure you all know of my love for the 4-cylinder K series, which is available here as the most basic 1.8 litre choice. It again sounds brilliant, it's exceptionally smooth for a 4-pot and it's very efficient as well. Now sure, there is that head gasket reputation, mainly as it was designed for small capacity super minis, metros and the like. But then it became a 1.8 and was fitted to big Rover 75s and Land Rover Freelanders. Regardless, the Rover K Series is a far better engine than any run-of-the-mill BMW 4-banger from a similar era. Yet the KV6 just isn't. The fact it's a V6 does mean it's very compact. It's very lightweight too, allowing it to be used to great effect in front drive cars. But its weaknesses in other areas means I can't help but compare it to the equivalent straight 6s that BMW were using. And in that company, it does fall a little flat, and makes me dream of a Rover 75 that looks and feels exactly as the real ones do, but with rear-wheel drive and a nice M52 or M54 straight 6. Curiously, however, the 75's diesel engine was not a version of Rover's own L series, which was reasonably powerful, very efficient and very reliable too, being found in not only a raft of Rover hatchbacks, but also the Freelander, badged as TD4, while a 5-cylinder version was used in the Discovery and Defender. Instead, this is a version of BMW's M47, converted for use in a transverse configuration. In all honesty, this is probably the 75's best engine, but it certainly doesn't suit the vibe I've not only centered this video around, but that Rover also found so central to their marketing of the car. If the Rover 75 is all about being unique and about a car that stylistically expresses itself, prioritising comfort, ambience, etc., then surely a nice 6-cylinder petrol engine is all you should really have. But clearly, I'm not Rover, because as mentioned, we believe in freedom of choice. That's why the Rover 75 gives you so many possibilities. But in the context of where Rover were in the late 90s, what I get from this brochure is not necessarily a sense of confidence, but instead a relaxation of expectations. Nobody would have ever expected this car to touch the sides of the sales of either the BMW 3 Series or the BMW 5 Series. Not only due to Rover's lack of infrastructure, but because the sporting vibe of those cars was so much more popular. Instead, the 75 in 1999 looks to me to be a relatively niche product, offered as an alternative to a BMW for someone looking for that opposite vibe from a car that still feels very special. Rather than being a Mondeo or Vectra competitor, a car built as a tool, the Rover speaks to me as a distinctly premium product, just not the one people really bought. After the couple's divorce, however, I don't see how the 75 could have coped on its own as a flagship without the introduction of the MG-ZT, which reversed all that character. I view this car, therefore, as a car that would never have existed without BMW's input, without BMW's assurance that Rover could be Rover, without having to worry about what Mr. Average wanted to drive, appealing to a more relaxed, self-assured and higher class customer base. As we get to this last page, in the back we have a price list, colour guide and indeed trim guide for the 75, featuring 3 fantastically expressive, if I can find them a little bit after this, 3 fantastically expressive individual line interior colours. And all of this, including the brochure itself, is available over on my Patreon in PDF form. But I'll leave us with this quote from Richard Woolley. Something every car enthusiast will relate to, that when you have parked the car, you'll want to glance back as you walk away. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.